A few years ago, I was invited to sit on an interfaith panel to teach about Judaism. I was there with leaders from different religious traditions and different religious communities. I was joined by leaders and clergy from Protestant and Catholic communities, Muslims and Hindus. Each of us had brought copies of our holy scriptures, our prayer books, the texts that were sacred to our faiths. And I was sitting there and listening to the other panelists share their wisdom and their perspective, waiting for my turn. We were talking about prayer or holidays or stories from our traditions. And at one point, I kind of shifted in my chair on the dais there, and my copy of the Bible that I had brought slipped out of my lap and fell on the floor. So I picked it up, held it up to kiss it, as Jews traditionally do with a sacred text that has fallen on the ground. And in that moment, I happened to look up and see all of the other panelists and everyone in the audience staring at me as I kissed this book. And it was then that I realized that Jews' relationships with books are a little different than they are in some of the world's other religious communities. We love books, it's true. We love words. In traditional settings, we are careful not to put them on the ground. We're restricted from bringing holy books into the bathroom. You can't use a copy of the Torah to prop open a door or rest your laptop on top of it to get the webcam a little bit higher. Think about the mezuzah, a kind of teeny tiny little book that we attach to our doorways so that we can taste just a little bit of its sweetness with a kiss every time we pass by them. It is for good reason that we call ourselves the people of the book. There is great power in text and in books. The things we read calibrate our priorities. They widen and polish the windows through which we view the world. The things we read prime our curiosity and make real even things that are radical and unimaginable. Henry Miller once asked, "Do you know what I call a book lying idle on a shelf? Wasted ammunition." When it comes to reading, especially reading fiction, to be a reader is to be entrusted with a great and terrible power. Because when reading their stories, you know more than the characters you have fallen in love with, more than they are ever capable of understanding in their own contexts. Oftentimes, this phenomenon is made even more pointed and painful when you, the reader, know exactly what's going to happen in the end of the book, though the characters on its pages cannot. Think about the great books of classic literature. We know, although they do not, that Hector's troops will be massacred and Troy will fall. We know, although they do not, that Romeo and Juliet are doomed, despite their love and devotion. We know, although they do not, that tragedy will claim Oedipus the king and Ahab the captain. It will take Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina. We know more than all of literature's kings and warriors and witches and oracles because we are readers. And we are also, of course, readers of Torah. And to encounter this book as a reader provides a similar experience as when we read those great works of fiction, but it's a little bit different when we read Torah, because in this case, too, we know how the story is going to end. But unlike Shakespeare or Homer or Jane Austen, this book we read over and over again, season after season, cycle after cycle, and we re-enter the sense of excitement and anticipation of knowing what's coming year after year. This Shabbat, we encounter Abraham, meeting him again for the very first time. In this portion, God meets him for the first time, too. And God calls him to accept a new direction in his life, to become history's first book kisser, history's first Jew. God calls him to assume a new sort of responsibility with his wife, Sarah, as the parents of a spiritual dynasty unlike any the world has ever seen. Lech lecha, God tells him. Go forth. It's a marvelous beginning for what will become a marvelous epic story. The initiation of the hero's journey, leaving what is safe and familiar to assume the quest which will define the rest of his life's work. It would be a wonderful story, even if it were any other kind of book, designed to be read and enjoyed and absorbed once. But we don't read this book like every other book. We come back to it every year at this season, experiencing the call of Abraham not as a one-time event, but as an annual refrain, changes our relationship with this story. It reshapes the emotional landscape through which we approach the structure of this story. Reading it for the first time or for the only time feels different than returning to it as a reader, moving up to its threshold and through its halls again and again and again. Every year we meet Abraham and Sarah anew. Every time we encounter them for the first time all over again. A kindly and humble couple in their 70s, approaching the twilight of their lives. They are childless but comfortable. They are anonymous but good-hearted. And they have every reason to believe that their lives' most significant moments have already come and gone. That's their perspective. But we readers, we who revisit their biographies year after year, not only are we just as familiar as they are with the way their story began, but we know, as they do not, how their story will end. We know, although Abraham does not, that he will become the founder of a great nation. We know that Sarah will bear him 2 sons, a miracle for which he had long ago given up hope. We know that the 2 of them will be remembered as the seed and source for the entire sweep of Jewish history, the spiritual parents of every soul born into Judaism and of those who choose to bind themselves to the covenant that begins in this chapter of the Torah that we read this week. But that's not all we know. We know his whole story. We know, although he does not, that the son for whom Abraham prayed will be bound on an altar as a human sacrifice at God's unthinkable command. We know that after that terrible moment of trauma and terror, he will never speak another word again to his son Isaac. We know that accepting the terms of God's covenant will lead Abraham to become a witness to the wholesale destruction of the mighty cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and their countless inhabitants. And we know as well that because of their fidelity to this covenant, many generations in the future, Abraham's offspring will be enslaved for 400 years of Egyptian captivity. We're the readers of Abraham's story, and in that capacity we are granted an uneasy power. We know what he does not. Our perspective, our experience, our familiarity with this story lets us see foreshadowing in every turn of his story, even as he moves guilelessly and obliviously through its contours. And so, we readers are led to a question. Knowing what we know, remembering what we remember about how this story will end, is it worth it? Is it worth it for Abraham to have responded to this call? Should he still do it, even knowing what's yet to come? Would he do it if he could somehow be granted our perspective, given a glimpse of clarity about what would happen to his children, to his nation, to his people, before signing on that great dotted line? And what if we were in his shoes, enjoying the fulfillment of a long and satisfying life by the side of the person we loved, with no great accomplishments to our name, but no great tragedies either? Would we have answered that call? Would we? The answer, I believe, I hope, is of course. Of course we would. That's the answer not only because there's a sort of narrative inevitability that comes from knowing the end of the story. Yes, we'd accept the call because we know how the story is supposed to end, that this quiet, childless couple will become the progenitors of a mighty spiritual movement. Of course we would take the deal, because readers like us who know things about Abraham's future that he himself cannot know, we see in him what he can't see in himself. We see what God sees: potential and power and hope, even if Abraham would never have thought to reckon those characteristics to himself. So this is what we gain from being a nation of readers. Just like Abraham, we are also the main characters in the stories of our lives. Just like him, we don't know what's coming. We might feel more comfortable at any given time hunkering down and staying nestled in the warm womb of what is familiar. But like Abraham, it is possible that there are greater things in store for us than we could ever imagine. What if there is a great, omniscient reader of our stories too? A wise spectator somewhere far above and beyond us, who delights with us when we succeed and sympathizes with us when we suffer, and who, when we see a door that opens before us, beckoning us into greatness, that reader holds their breath, just waiting eagerly and excitedly for us to discover that the best is yet to come. Every successful venture, every new business, every exhilarating new relationship and daring new endeavor, all of those things require the willingness and bravery and vulnerability to answer a call, to accept an invitation to begin something unseen. Every example of divine encounter and transformation in our spiritual tradition and beyond it, they all begin with upheaval and change. God is never found in convention or habit, as my teacher, Rabbi Alan Liu, writes. Now, that is not to say that all pain is meaningful, or that all disruption leads to growth. But the converse is true. Without disruption, there is no growth. Without rupture and destabilization, there is no inspiration. Whether it's Abraham's story or Moses's or Esther's, we can never come into the fullness of ourselves and realize the wholeness of what God hopes for us until we are willing to step forward into uncertainty. And so this, finally, is what produces the gifts we enjoy as readers of Torah, above and beyond the many cultural riches of a life of reading the world's other great works of literature. Because when we return to this story, to our story, year after year, when we come back to him again after a year's absence, we long to tell Abraham something we can't tell Macbeth or Agamemnon: there is a better day coming. This is the hope that animated Frederick Douglass's vision of the white ships at harbor. The words are true for him. The words are true for us as well. There is a better day coming. If we can see with God's eyes and believe with God's confidence in the words that we cherish and the books that we kiss, there is, in my story and in yours, a better day that will come. Shabbat shalom and happy reading, everybody.